I'd just like us to think about that passage for a moment from Hebrews chapter 11. I remember, this is going back many years, how much I used to enjoy reading stories to my children when they were young, and how much they used to enjoy listening to the story, provided that the story had a happy ending. What was really irritating in some ways was when a story had the ending in volume 2, if you like. You know, there's a story but the ending was later on. That just wouldn't do. To be continued never went down very well. We do expect a story to have a good start, a middle bit with all the twists and turns to keep our interest and exciting things going on, and then a happy ending. And what we've got referred to in our passage today from Hebrews chapter 11 is the life stories of some of the people in the Old Testament. And Hebrews 11 is a great passage on faith and what it is to live by faith. And to help us to understand what faith is, I'd like us just to focus on one of those characters, and that is Abraham. Abraham in the book of Genesis was a man who was called by God to leave his homeland and to go to a land that God had promised him. And he did that by faith. He didn't know where he was going, but he had a promise of God. And the promise that God gave him, and it developed over time, was that he would give that land to Abraham and to his ancestors, and that ultimately his ancestors would multiply, and through him, all peoples on earth would be blessed. So with a promise, Abraham took the big step. He left his home, he left the people he knew, he left familiarity, and he went to this place he'd never seen to dwell there because God had told him to. So the story had a great start. Abraham set off in faith. And then if we were to look through the book of Genesis, what we would see if we looked back is at times Abraham struggled with his faith. Now that's not mentioned in Hebrews 11 because Hebrews 11 is all about living by faith, and therefore it doesn't mention the struggles and the hardships, but they were there. I mean, at one point, Abraham went down into Egypt and he lied about his wife, and it caused all sorts of problems. And then eventually he went back to the place where he met with God and he put things right. But it was a struggle. And then he had this promise that he would have a son, and that through his son, through his line of descent, all people would be blessed. But he struggled with it. He struggled as to how that would go about, and he made all sorts of mistakes. And over time, he had to learn. And eventually, he realized that it was a descendant through his wife Sarah was going to be the one of the promise. But it took him a long time to see that, and he'd struggled all the way to get there. And then he struggled with the fact that he was old and Sarah was old and Sarah was barren. It took a long time for Abraham to really learn what it was to live by faith. So we've got in the story the good start, we've got the twists and turns going through. But if we're really to grasp the essence of Hebrews 11 and the key points, what we have to recognize is that story did not have in his lifetime a happy ending. That story was to be continued. The happy ending wasn't going to come, if you like, till volume 2. There was no happy ending. Abraham trusted in God. He learned to trust in God, but he never saw the outcome of what he was trusting in. We look back in Genesis. Abraham had been promised he would inherit this land. He went to live in this land. He traveled in the land that God had called him to dwell in. And when it came to the end of the life of his wife, Sarah, what we read is that Abraham had to go to the Hittites, the people who lived in that land already, and he negotiated with them to buy a small plot of land in which to bury Sarah. He didn't have a grave plot even, he had to do that. So he had this promise of the land and he didn't own any of it. He had to negotiate to buy that small little plot. And then he was holding on to the promise that through his son, who had now been born, all people on earth would be blessed. But his son wasn't even married. That promise was as far from being fulfilled at the end of Abraham's life as it was at the beginning. Abraham never saw it. It must have been a long way removed from the hopes that he had when he answers God's call. When God said, leave your homeland, leave the people you know, and go and live in that land that I've promised you. When he did that, those people living around about him, they must have thought he was mad. They said, what's he doing? He's leaving all the security, he's going to a place that he doesn't know, and he's leaving all his friends, and all the cost of that, they'd have thought him odd, strange, but... And really his circumstances were no different. They'd have felt exactly the same as at the end of his life as it was at the beginning of that story. Now, Abraham died living a second-class life. He must have been tempted to look back and to remember, but he never went back. Far removed from the hopes he'd have had at the beginning. Now, that's a state of living that many of us as Christian believers find really hard to enter into. Really hard to enter into. We get this picture of the life of faith being that, we encounter God, we're called by him, we follow his call, we go through the twists and turns and the difficulties and the struggles, but we're expecting life to come good. And faith kicks in when it doesn't come good. And that's the whole key point of this passage. And often, by not grasping that reality, it spoils our spiritual lives. We don't develop in our relationship with God in the way that he wants us to and in the way in which we could. I can ask you just to imagine for a moment. Imagine, if you can, a pair of semi-detached houses. The identical, one side looks like the other, semi-detached houses. And in the one, or maybe the one on the left, you've got Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith is a Christian believer. And in the other house, you've got Mr. Jones. Now, Mr. Smith, of course, is different from Mr. Jones because Mr. Smith goes to church every Sunday. But Mr. Jones has also got his social interests, whatever they are. It might be the golf club or something like that. So he goes to the golf club every Sunday. Now, of course, Mr. Smith, he supports his local church. He pays financially and so on. So there's a big difference. But Mr. Jones also pays his subscriptions to his golf club. So they're looking very similar. Both Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones both go on holiday twice a year. Mr. Jones likes to change his car every 3 years, but so does Mr. Smith. Mr. Jones gets concerned about his career, but so does Mr. Smith. In every way, their life looks the same, and in many ways, their expectations and their hopes for the future look the same. Spot the difference between the Christian believer and the non-Christian believer can actually often be very difficult and a hard thing to do. Paul's helpful here when he wrote to the Colossians chapter 3, when he simply said, set your heart on things above. Focus on the heavenly. Focus beyond the current. Abraham's heart was set on the promise. That focus gave him discernment. It helped him over time to learn to live differently. He was focused on the promise. Now, think about it. He didn't have a home to live in. He was nomadic. He was living in tents. Did that matter to the promise? No. So it was insignificant. He didn't live in a city like many other people live in a city. Did it matter the promise? No. So he's willing to give it up because it didn't matter. Lot, his nephew, made that mistake. He said, I must live in a city, and it had awful consequences. If anyone wants to read the story, he lived in isolation. People still thought he was odd for the choices that he made. Did it matter to the promise? No, it didn't. Abraham died and was contented to die, living what externally would have looked like a second-class life. We as Christian believers are called to live different. In fact, the world is realizing that as humanity, we have to live differently. It's a good illustration, what we focused on this morning in our harvest, as to what that is like. We have to make choices to change, because if we really believe that adverse effects are happening and we want to do something about it, we have to make a choice. Well, that's an illustration, maybe, of the call to us as Christian believers. We're called to look beyond. The fulfillment of the promise is not now. The story starts with a call. It's got the twists and turns of life's experiences, but the happy ending is beyond. It's in volume 2. It's to be continued. And it's important that we grasp that, because grasping that is what is meant by faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 starts by telling us that faith is believing in those things that we cannot see.